Hi everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Today I'm speaking with Steve Sallis. Steve was a former academy footballer for Brighton and Hove Albion for 8 years, which ended and led to an education career. In fact, sports and education have been Steve's life. Steve worked in 4 schools in total and 2 in special measures over a 5-year period. In 2008, he was shortlisted for the National Teacher of the Year award, and he was a deputy head teacher with responsibility for whole school teaching and learning, which mainly involved coaching colleagues and adding value to teaching pedagogy. He completed his master's degree in teaching, learning, leadership and psychology from King's College London in 2013. Recently working at the coalface of the professional football industry, Steve was heavily involved in academy management at a championship football club, ensuring players and coaches fulfill their personal and professional objectives. This included collaboration with playing and coaching staff about how to improve learning, delivery, and also supporting staff and players in achieving outstanding outcomes in every facet of their role. Today he works with the England girls across the development age groups, and he supports several Premier League and Football League players with mental conditioning support. And he's just written a book called Educating Football, and I know that's what we're going to focus on today. So Steve, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
No worries, mate. I think that was the longest introduction that I've done, so you've got some background, mate.
It's been a challenge, yes. 1,000,000% been a challenge, but I'm here to still tell the story.
Well, challenge is what helps us grow. I know that myself. So tell us a little bit about the story. You've written this book, which I've read, which is absolutely fantastic, and I'd love to go step by step through this book because there's some brilliant things for coaches and players and parents in there. What brought you round to writing a book, mate? I'm assuming it's all those mini micro challenges you had over the years in both education, football, sport, etc.
It was just an interesting place. In 2013, I left teaching, and just to go back slightly, the story goes. I've been in inner London schools for many years. And one day I completely knew that my time was up, and I'd worked in some seriously tough places. And an ex-pupil, believe it or not, told me about the Millwall job, and talk about life karma. As I've said this on other podcasts before, that we have to understand that how fortunate we are to do the job that we do, and have gratitude. But when an ex-pupil texts you, and I said this in the book, that he's changed my life. So thanks to Chris Eva from Active Kids, that now owns a sports company. I was bailing him out of science lessons for telling teachers to F off for probably about 18 months. And with loads of mentoring, not just from me, but loads of great teachers, he turned into a really effective businessman in South East London, and works with loads of primary schools now, and is a really rounded, educated guy. But at that time, he needed help. So that's a story, really. And I was just finishing my master's degree. So going back to the question, the book came about because I was almost on withdrawal symptoms of just writing, just in a habit. I did a part-time master's, so it took me 3.5 years to do with a full-time deputy head post, which, as you know, nearly killed me. And simply, I was just in a habit of writing. That's the simple answer. I then joined Millwall January 2014, and all the staff were sitting around a table over breakfast, as we did, and talking about what I studied in my masters. And it was actually Seb Barton, the goalie coach that's now at Arsenal, that said, "Sallis, have you ever thought about writing a book?" And I went, "No, but I might as well start." And that night, it was a Thursday night, I don't remember the exact date in January, and I went to the pub with my friends and I said, "I'm going to write a book." And they all laughed. And that morning I got into work about an hour early and wrote the first chapter. And the first chapter was He Can't Do That, it was called, which respectfully it was about nothing to do with the Millwall crew. It was just about all of the coaches that I'd seen in my lifetime that naturally have a mindset of players can't do things. And I suppose coming from a teacher where you don't have that mentality, you have kids for 5 years and you've got to work with them. So that was really the start of the journey, Dan. Did
that end up being the first chapter proper?
No, it didn't actually. I don't know exactly where it is in the book. It's somewhere. I think it's somewhere chucked in the middle. No, the first chapter's my experiences is obviously Jimmy Bullard, who will probably be known to your listeners for being an ex-Premier League player and now on Sky Sports as the Soccer AM presenter. So really, the reason that he was the first was because everywhere I go in the country or wherever I go anywhere, everyone just says, "Oh, what was Bullard like?" And I suppose that I had to really put that as quite an easy opener to my journey with him, because it was a complete privilege, although it being non-league, it was still a privilege to be asked to be his assistant manager, and not many people get those experiences, right? So.
And what was he like?
What was he like?
And what is he like? Right, I've heard that.
What was he like and what is he like? Yeah. His coaching's phenomenal. He's one of the most visionary coaches I've ever worked with in terms of what he wants to see. His vision in and out of position is watertight. There is no negotiation, respectfully, with that and his vision. He wants to play, he wants to pass. And I think early doors we struggled. We were in the bottom four at Leatherhead for about 7 months, Dan. It felt like forever. And people would know the Isthmian League. The Isthmian League's very famous in England, in English football, because it's a very rigorous league. It takes no prisoners. It's challenging. It's very physical. The pitches are not amazing. But at the same time, I think we could probably name in England 11 from Isthmian League football. Obviously, Stuart Pearce and Peter Crouch dropped down to Dulwich, and Ian Wright, and all these players. They've all played at that level. So
is that a step 6, step 7, step 8, something like that?
No, that's step 3 of non-league.
Yeah.
So it goes Conference National 5, Conference South 6. Yeah, so it'd be step 7.
Yeah.
So he was just excellent. He'd ring me up every Saturday morning and scream down the phone, as he would, and say, "It's game day, Sallis. It's game day." And but generally, it was brilliant. And I suppose the caveat to our culture and our vision was that we finished with 24 points out of 30, with the same team and the same formation, and we just kept sticking to the process, as we used to call it. When many managers, and I'll talk about this in chapter, would have folded and changed probably lots of things. But we kept believing in the players and the process. So that was a great experience. We finished 13th in the league, which was incredible, really, because we were in the bottom 4 for literally 40 games.
Is he still coaching there now?
No, he's not. He's gone back to Soccer AM now. So he's left. He does that full time. Well, he does that on his Friday, Saturday. But yeah, good times. Really good times.
So how does the book start out? So what I love about what you've done, Steve, is you've got 6 sections: warm up, first half, half time, second half, final whistle, extra time. So I want to go through each section because I know there's going to be some brilliant practical takeaway stuff and some great philosophies in there with all the experience you've had working with players and coaches across the game in England. So you start with Section 1, as you would do with the warm-up, and you titled that section Football Foundations. So tell us a bit about Football Foundations. I know you have a number of chapters within each section, but you've alluded to starting there with the experience with Jimmy, but tell me a bit about what you perceive to be Football Foundations.
Yeah, I mean, the Football Foundations, don't take that word as really anything. That was just an alliteration which sounded reasonably good.
I've been there, yeah.
Yeah, so we don't really want to go too far down that line. I suppose that, as I say in the book at the start and introduction, it's so important that I pose as many questions as I do answers. And anyone that's worked with me, and I've worked with a lot of people in education and a lot of people in football, will know that I am strong with my opinions, will know that those opinions are based on experiences that the average football coach hasn't got, and I don't mean that to be derogatory to anyone. My experiences are my experiences, and I can't change those. But I suppose that when you're working with the people that I've worked with, you get guys that are knocking on your door, played in FA Cup finals against Ronaldo, and they say, "Sallis," as most people call me by my surname, Dan. They say, "Sallis, can I have some help, please?" And it makes you feel pretty good. And my point being about creating great A-level students or great GCSE students or just great people, that there isn't a correct journey. So I suppose I get a bit frustrated when people say, oh, you've got to do it like this and you've got to teach like that and you've got to coach like that. So really, in summary to your question, it was ensuring that I provide as many questions as I do answers, and making sure that our self-awareness around how we behave, and as I've said in the book, how we act and interact is key. So the Football Foundation's part is really touching on talent, creating winners, how we achieve success. I've got a chapter called the Mario Balotelli effect and difficult football players, and my experiences of him as an example. It's not necessarily about Balotelli, it's just about difficult footballers. Talk about the 10,000 hours of practice, and obviously a lot of people know or may not know about 10,000 experiences instead, and really just a real questions-based approach to getting people thinking about, as I say, being a better thinker.
And you've mentioned Balotelli there, and I know from my experience within coaching of all sports that every coach has to deal with and manage challenging players, challenging people. Tell us a bit about your thoughts on that one.
Let me just give the listeners an example of my experiences on this note. Now, I worked at schools in the Borough of Greenwich in South East London. The Borough of Greenwich is fundamentally one of the most challenging boroughs in the UK, and let me give you a caveat to that. In the neighbouring borough in Bexley and Bromley, there's the grammar school system. So all of the kids in Year 6, all of the most academic children, don't stay at their local comprehensive, which other kids in the country would choose to do, simply because there's a better choice in terms of academia down the road. Which means that the Borough of Greenwich, traditionally, for 60, 70 years, has never had top-end kids from primary school go to their own secondary schools because they choose to go to Bexley and Bromley. So it meant that the types of children that we dealt with were constantly, very, very challenging. So my point to this, I've seen kids come in stab vests as 12-year-olds, and with 7 years of mentoring, and I keep going back to the word mentoring, with rigour from teaching assistants, from London Challenge, and from all these people, amazing people that can help these disaffected young people. I've seen people come with stab vests end up going to Oxbridge 7 years later. So I'm lucky that I've had those experiences, and I know that loads of people haven't had those experiences. So the reason I'm so passionate about this chapter is because I say in the chapter, should you blame him or the people that created him? And it's not a blame, it's not meant to be challenging blame. None of the book's about blame. What the book is challenging people and saying, can you do better? Can you do more? We have a player, and let's forget Balotelli here, because that wouldn't be fair on him. But let's just say we've got a dysfunctional player as an adult. How have they turned into a dysfunctional adult? And I know some people will say, oh, well, they're an adult, they've got to make their own choices into adulthood. But remember, everyone's conditioning is different. Everyone's physiology is different. Everyone's experiences and emotions are different. Everyone's physiology behind anxiety are potentially different. So you've got to be respectful of that. And I'm not saying it's okay for dysfunctional children to turn into dysfunctional adults and never change. What I'm saying is that somewhere along that pathway, we get dysfunctional people in society because of their environment. And if you don't create an environment which is high-end and high quality, then basically what you're going to do is end up with issues later down the line.
So we've got a lot of coaches who will coach at college level or at high school level, 16 to 18-year-olds, 18 to 22-year-olds, older players at the elite level, at the developing elite level. So if a coach has a specific player who is quite maladaptive in that coaching environment, whether it's as simple as being stroppy, whether it's extreme maladaptive behaviour, how can a coach deal with that? And kind of understand, I'm asking you a slightly unfair question because we're just going to hypothesize here, but maybe looking at it from a point of view of what do coaches get wrong? Coaches can easily go, well, this person's got a bad attitude and there's nothing I can do about that. He or she has all the skill in the world, but there's nothing I can do with this player. what kind of things can a coach do? Is it that they're too insistent? Is it that they try to coach instruction when they should be asking the kind of questions that that tap into the creativity of a player? What is it that they need to do with a maladaptive player?
It's a challenging question you put to me there. I've got a few sayings. That one thing I do stand by is every behaviour needs a consequence. This isn't some draconian autocratic statement. A consequence could be something quite low level. My point being that in a group setting that you be denied, and I do a lot of behaviour work in schools with middle leaders, senior leaders, head teachers, all variables really. And in the football industry, it makes the process a little bit easier because a lot of the kids want to be there.
Sure.
Because the kids are doing it. But the every behaviour needs a consequence. I think is really, really valuable. When you mentioned about their behaviours, I mean, without stating the obvious, a lot of the poor teachers that I've seen can't control their own emotions, let alone the kids. So I do say this, intelligence, and I write about this in the book later on, that Dr. Jake Nash, who works at FC Norgeland now, he's just an old family friend, a real man of sociology and socialisation, and he talks to me all the time about, he says, Sallis, intelligence is about behaviour, end of story. So what we need to be careful of, an A licence, a pro licence, a degree, whatever these qualifications all have, that doesn't justify anything. If you don't behave in an appropriate way and model good behaviour, that's key. I have a big saying that, mirror positive behaviour, don't mirror negative behaviour. That's something I'd help, ask the listeners to reflect on. So, if you see good behaviours, then you can copy that, and if you see bad behaviours from young people, then or old people, then don't mirror that. That's really important. And another one is the Batari box, which I put a diagram in the book. Which the Batari box is an old teaching classic, which is don't let someone else's attitudes and behaviours affect your attitudes and behaviours. And I say this with experience because my career has been bundles and bundles of failures. But you'll find yourself arguing with a 14-year-old kid from South London. And then you find yourself 30 seconds later going, what the heck am I doing here? I've got a sanction system in place. I've got a rewards policy in place. I've got a process behind me to back me, and I'm finding myself getting sucked in. So I'd be lying to say if I hadn't been sucked into these altercations with young people. But, without stating the obvious, the consequence to behaviour needs to be watertight. And if you look at any sort of high-end culture of any business or football club, there is that process. And actually, it was really interesting one with Southgate in the World Cup, not putting a ban on the players' mobile phones. Obviously as people get older, there needs to be that level of leadership needs to become much more aligned into a relationship, as I call it. And he didn't put a ban on the players, but with young people, you can't always do that. Young people don't have the brain science to be more rational about their thoughts. So sometimes you do have to be strict. And I know it's an old teaching classic, but they say don't smile at the year 7s until after Christmas. I've softened now as a practitioner, but when you're early in your career and you haven't got a bigger toolbox as a practitioner, it is quite sensible probably not to smile at the year 7s until after Christmas, because the job is challenging and you can't show that weakness. And I think as people grow older, you're able to become kinder. But my plan for a 5-year journey from 11 to 18s was to be their mate from 16 to 18, not be their mate at 14, because fundamentally I'm just there to teach them. I'm not there to be their friend.
The notion of a 20-year-old who gets stroppy about being benched pales into insignificance as compared to the 12-year-old who comes into school in a stab vest and 6 years later ends up going to Oxford or Cambridge. That's an extreme example, but that's what you're alluding to, the kind of shift that can happen, the kind of behavioural shift that can happen. You've mentioned some really important things there, such as applying consequences to behaviour, such as modelling great attitudes, being as a teacher, being a great person. What else? What else is there that these teachers do that you've experienced that helps people grow? Because ultimately that's what we're trying to do as coaches.
If I had £1 for seeing coaches start a session and delivering a session talking about football. And obviously the session is fundamentally about football, but how about asking them how their day was? How about asking who their favourite teacher is? How about asking their favourite subject to school? How about asking them how they are and how they feel today? How about having it? And I suppose it goes back to aspiration. It goes back to fundamentals of relationships. It goes back to many variables of creating an elite culture. But, they say in sales, don't they, people buy from people. All right. So in education, pupils fundamentally want, children have done for centuries, a fun teacher. Pupils fundamentally want a teacher with knowledge so they can impart that knowledge. Pupils fundamentally want someone that's going to put them in line. The amount of student teachers I've seen that try and be cool and trendy, but just get that balance wrong because they're not actually... Kids also want boundaries. They want clear, precise, fundamental boundaries. But a 20-year-old footballer, honestly, Dan, I would argue they're not that much different. That's what I've learned about going from... obviously, as much as you're working with kids, I was still line managing over 20 people at one stage, in terms of adults and middle leaders. So fundamentally, people want care, they want attention, they want your time, they want love, they want you to know that you care. And there's a saying that children won't let you care about them until you know that they know that you care. So there's all of these little nuggets, but fundamentally, subject knowledge, and I say this about any great teacher, if you have knowledge to give, you're going to be in a very good place, because instead of worrying about behaviour, you're teaching them things. Instead of worrying about the low level things, you're in a place where the kids are so gripped and engaged in you that they want to listen to everything that you've got to say. So I hope that sort of helps your listeners. It's quite difficult to describe in many ways because it's all in context of the types of kids you have and also what your key performing indicators are with the ability of your team. If your team are not a very able team, bless them, then your job really is to add value. If your team have an opportunity to win a trophy, then maybe that's a KPI for you. I really can't answer it all because it's different in different contexts and different cultures and in different countries.
I think you've done a great job, mate, because I think you've hit upon some words, some concepts that are absolutely vital across contexts. And I appreciate what you're saying about the contextual nature of this. But you've mentioned that players want a teacher or a coach who is fun, is knowledgeable, provides boundaries. I think that's true of guys and girls in their 20s and 30s as well, that cares for them, they have that closeness. And I think what's really interesting is the kind of stuff that you're talking about there relates to some of the things we've spoken about before on the Sports Psych show. For instance, the care, the closeness, creating closeness is what Professor Sophia Jarrett spoke about in an earlier episode. She spent her life studying coach-athlete relationships and how closeness and a commitment to developing closeness, that doesn't necessarily, as she would describe, doesn't necessarily mean liking each other. It might just be finding some common ground. That's imperative.
But Dan, sorry to interrupt your flow. Is that not common sense?
But I don't think people do common sense when they're socialised into what they think a context or a situation requires. And I would come back at you there and I would say the context of coaching in sport is X's and O's historically. That's how we're socialised into this.
Yeah, true.
That's how we're socialised into coaching. That's my big argument, Steve. That's why I set up this show. That's you will do what you do for a reason. I do what I do in part because I'm passionate about spreading the word that coaching is psychosocial. Teaching is psychosocial first and foremost. And as I always say, Steve, and I'm going to bore everybody about this, but yes, we've got the tech, the tact, the physical sides. We know that, and that's imperative, and there's great people doing great things in those areas. But you can't have excellence in those without the psychosocial. So I think we're so socialised into those that people forget, or maybe they don't even consider at times those. So people don't do common sense when they're not when it's not at the forefront of their mind. In my opinion, mate. In my opinion.
Well, I mean, sorry to interrupt your flow.
No. Go.
David Cottrell was talking this morning, the former Birmingham player, about, as an example, his mental health issues.
Yeah.
And he was potentially putting the blame at the managers. But I tweeted earlier saying it's not necessarily the managers, it's the managers above the managers. And we've got this 4-corner model, but I said you might as well call it the 3-corner triangle, because I've never known an industry, and football is the place where I love, but I've never known an industry that talks about 4 concepts and only delivers 3. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but you can blame the managers all you want, but the chairman and the CEOs have got to take responsibility for general duty of care to create that 4-corner model in terms of rigour. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that. How long have we got here? I think an appropriate, and I'm talking across all sports here, and I'm talking about at every level, whether it's high school, whether it's college in the States, whether it's university over in England, globally, whether it's elite professional or developing professional. I think all clubs have a responsibility, just as all organisations within the corporate sector or the public sector have a responsibility to create an environment around the psychosocial, around helping players, helping people flourish and thrive, because I think then you optimise people's ability to work together and to produce an outcome or output that's desirable from the leaders, from the CEOs and the chairman. So it feels kind of contradictory that chairman and CEOs wouldn't try to deliver appropriate organisation-led environments and cultures in accordance to what we're saying. I think historically in sports, managers, head coaches, if that's the term in some sports, have been the role has been all-encompassing, and too often organisations are, if we're talking in sport here, too often organisations are manager or head coach led. And when that head coach or that manager is just all about the X's and the O's, which is changing, then that's what it becomes. And an appreciation of the psychosocial and appreciation of the environment isn't necessarily covered. So I think organisations do need to be more in tune with what people want and what people need to develop themselves.
Yeah, I think, and that's where my school experiences have been unbelievable, that you can't get a special measures school which is failing out of special measures without strategy. And going from a middle leader into a senior leader as an early 30s sort of teacher was a massive culture shock for me, because it truly made me understand the importance of leadership at an applied level rather than theoretical level. And without strategy, without stating the obvious, Dan, you're pretty stuffed, aren't you, in any business?
Absolutely. I mean, I think another interesting word you used there, I mean, to go back over fun, boundaries, care, knowledge. I think you said a really important thing that supports what we're saying about psychosocial driven cultures, is when you have great knowledge as a coach or a teacher. That's so important. And in coming back to a previous Sports Psych show guest, Doug Lemov, who's an educationalist, a wonderful teacher of teachers.
A legend, Dan, a legend.
Indeed. And he said himself, look, all the high-fiving is fantastic and it's great, and that's important, obviously. High five as a metaphor for relationships, but you can't substitute knowledge. Having that knowledge as well, and obviously enveloping that knowledge in the relationship, in the psychosocial, is vital. How one imparts that knowledge, or how you help people players learn that knowledge, is vital. But having that knowledge when a person speaks with you and you're able to offer value, wow, that's so important, isn't it?
Mm. And on this point, actually, you've just given me a cue to mention something that where we've got to be really careful is, and I said this at the Football League conference in the summer, is that every child or every adult at some stage in their life has had the greatest ever coach or the greatest ever teacher. Now, if you don't act and interact and behave in a way that their greatest ever coach and greatest ever teacher did, you're actually a subconscious downgrade. So I don't mean that to scare every coach out there, but if there's things going on that aren't, that are gaps in your knowledge that you need to identify, you need to sort of find them as quick as you can, because every player that you've got has got a history, and every player that you've got has got an experience of someone that's absolutely brilliant. And if you can't reach those heights, then to a child, you're an automatic downgrade. So, I always used to challenge this to the teachers that I led on, because it's important that we get that self-awareness to understand that there's some really good people out there, and what are they doing that you're not doing, and can you sort of follow them on their journey?
I would also say that having the knowledge and having the capability to impart that knowledge is psychosocial, because learning knowledge yourself as a coach, as a teacher, is psychosocial, is in having the capacity to sit down and build your knowledge banks requires focus and motivation and effective learning skills, and then imparting that knowledge. Steve, do I do it in a directive manner? Am I instructional? Do I do it in a non-directive manner? Do I ask questions? What kind of questions should I ask? When do I become directive? When do I stay non-directive? How do people process information on a deep level? That person does it in a different way to that person over there. So within your sort of 4 pillars here of fun, knowledge, boundaries and care, I would still say the knowledge piece is still within the psychosocial piece.
And I think the knowledge, so the listeners are clear, the knowledge piece really embeds everything. So, subject knowledge is your behaviour for learning skills. Subject knowledge is your assessment for learning skills. Subject knowledge is your ability to plan effectively and question effectively. So I think it's important that I'll get some, meat to the bone for that quote about subject knowledge, because subject knowledge is everything. Subject knowledge is soft skills. Subject knowledge is sensing your audience, and I suppose I used to get, when I was a younger teacher, when people used to say to me at uni lectures, they'd say, "Oh, people won't remember what you taught them; they'll remember how you made them feel." And I suppose in my early 20s, I was like, "Oh, right, yeah, that's a really good quote." But if I'm honest, which is what Doug Limov says, it's a complete load of nonsense, because I make kids feel good over the years because I teach them stuff, and because I teach them stuff, they feel good. So. We've got to be clear about that. I've seen a lot of coaches and teachers that are a bit of a laugh and a bit of a Jack the Lad, or all joking around. But kids don't want a joker. Kids want someone that's going to make them better. And when you make them better, then they'll like you. So something for listeners to certainly reflect on.
As I was writing those 4 words down, fun, knowledge, boundaries, care, / closeness, I also wrote another word down, and I wanted you to comment on this: responsibility. Responsibility, as in, isn't an important part of this as well, helping people go from good to great, helping people flourish, helping young people grow. Surely helping them take responsibility is a massive factor in this as well.
I'm just writing notes now, actually, because you're challenging me really well here, so well done. I'm looking at player ownership as this umbrella. And then underneath, you're talking about growth, and I've just sort of written growth mindset. And I suppose another thing that winds me up about the Carol Dweck sort of pedagogy, so for the listeners, is the growth and fixed mindset stuff. And that's trending on social media at the moment, Dan, and it's like, oh yeah, respond from failure like this, and you do this. And fundamentally, Carol Dweck's physiology and brain science is bulletproof, and she's a massive, influence of mine. But I just don't think people have understood about growth mindset and ownership. And let me give you an example of why. If you tell a 15-year-old kid, as an example from South London, just to keep having a growth mindset and be reflective, they'll look at you and go, "Shut up, I don't know what you're talking about." Telling a 15-year-old to keep having a growth mindset, they will say to you, "What the heck does that mean? How does it feel?" So, for my master's research, and this is actually highly relevant because I've applied this now, I applied this at Millwall. to scaffold that, so scaffold is obviously just giving kids access to more complex scenarios.
Yeah.
So to scaffold that, I created, and this is genuinely something I'm really proud of through all my own research, a learning to learn policy. Now, so instead of talking about football, instead of talking about history, instead of talking about art, instead of talking about receiving the ball on the back foot, we're talking about how we learn to receive the ball. We're talking about how we learn about football, how we learn about art, how we learn about history. So actually bringing learning back a step completely, because if the kids fundamentally haven't got a learning toolbox, you can't teach them anything anyway. And that learning toolbox could be all of the marginal gains, like eye contact, good body language, which are common sense things to an expert, but not so common sense things to the beginner coaches. Other things like coaches saying, yeah, my kids love me, this and that, you hear that all the time. And then you'll do learning walks, and then you'll speak to the kids, and you say, the kids will go, they're too scared to ask the teacher a question. So if you look at learning to learn, kids have to be able to have the bravery, and children we know get nervous, they get scared, they get worried. So the reason this book is about self-awareness is how the soft skills add in value to the true, authentic nature of people's lives, because we know, even in adults, when I do adult seminars, adults are still too scared to say they don't know something. So when we say learning to learn, learning to be a better learner is saying, I don't understand, can you please rephrase that? Can you please tell me that again? And most people will know when they work with me, I will stand up in the middle of a big room and say, sorry, I don't understand, can you repeat that? Now, I don't want to medal for that, but I don't have to worry about that. My tip to all the listeners is, yet again, stop talking about football all of the time and start talking about how we can learn to be better at football. And I know that might be quite an abstract context for a lot of listeners, but it will really help you, and it will really help the learners that you have.
Do you think that learning starts with self-awareness? You've used this term self-awareness a lot already in this interview. Do you think learning how to learn starts with self-awareness?
I think it starts with conversations, call them learning conversations. I think it starts with lots of informal processes, mentorings, one-to-ones. I think that when you talked about ownership comes from having a toolbox. So you ask, talk about player ownership at Millwall as an example. The players were doing their own reviews. Why would we do them when the players can review themselves? My another issue with that is often coaches want to see things that are really clean, Dan. Like, oh, it didn't work, so we're not doing it. Well, the kids, I would say, look, the kid's 15. Why are they going to deliver in a really good way straight away? They're not going to. Coaching's the same, and this is why Ben Bartlett's one of, why my sidekicks in life, because Ben will challenge the norms. Ben will say, why does it have to be so clean, you're coaching all the time? No, it doesn't. Sometimes learning is ugly. Sometimes learning is boring. So learning that sometimes learning is boring is massive, because then you're going to get buy-in when it does get boring. I know I might be sort of going around the houses here a little bit, but it's so important to, yet again, gaps in learning. I say this to the Millwall lads, do you know what you don't know? Where is the blind spots in your repertoire that you don't even know exists? And if you don't know that exists, my advice to everyone is go and find out by hook or by crook what is out there in order to make yourself better.
Which is an effective question to ask that helps people become more self-aware. So knowing and understanding what you've not got, what you need to get better, what you need to go out and find answers to. And I assume there's the flip side, which is, this is what I'm strong at, this is what I'm good at, this is what I bring to the table, these are the character strengths that I have. Have you found in your work that people's characteristics, their personality characteristics, work for them and work against them?
Yes, I mean, I'm actually working with 5 head teachers at the moment, which is a challenge within itself, but they're lovely and they're open. So I started with them last week I'm doing some mentoring for them on the very simple RAG rating, Dan, which your readers probably or possibly would know, which is just simply red, amber, green. The greens are the things that they're good at, the ambers are the things that they're okay at and looking to develop, and the reds are the things that they're generally not very good at all. and it's okay to have loads of reds. If you'd have seen my gymnastics teaching back in the 90s, it would have been the worst gymnastics teacher in the history of Great Britain. I was shocking. So I'm cool to admit that, and I'm cool to admit I was terrible at lots of other things. So I think that, yet again, when you're looking at team environments, when you're looking at development, when you're looking at teaching and learning, that understanding of target setting, whatever you want to call it, the target setting is often linked from a baseline self-assessment process, isn't it? Which will be supported with younger kids by the coach or the teacher. A lot of the kids haven't got this knowledge, and that's why teacher input is brilliant, because the teachers can guide these kids to become more independent as they get older. And what I keep saying is that learning to learn is learning. We're all learning to learn, Dan, aren't we? We're all growing, we're all evolving. It doesn't stop, it doesn't start, it just keeps blending from one into another. So I don't want listeners to get weirded out and go, oh my God, where do I start? Where do I stop? You just got to keep hanging around the right people, doing the right things, and steering knowledge off for all of the people that are going to make you better.
And read your book, and steering back to the book in section 2, which is predominantly about teaching tips. And we're kind of covering this as we're talking. This is happening organically here, but to hone in on teaching and teaching tips, would you say a coach has to be a great teacher? Is a coach a teacher? Is that how you would see it?
Well, Terry Venables was on this video, which I use for social media, saying the great coaches are teachers, and I know Cruyff has said it as well. And so fundamentally, I've put a chapter in my book about the difference between coaches and teachers, and what are you? That's in section 3. And what are you? Are coaches missing a trick? And I suppose that I can only go from my own lens, and that's really important. That coaching is 1,000,000% improved. Pedagogy's improved, subject knowledge has improved, processes improved, the monitoring of learning has improved. But I suppose that genuinely in my heart, is teaching still ahead of coaching in general terms? If I'm truly honest, Dan, from what I see, yes it is. Is it behind in other terms, as in coaching ahead of teaching? Then coaching is definitely ahead. But in terms of a teaching and learning concept, I have to say this, coaching has got a lot to do at all levels.
So be specific for me, where you can. What do you see when you see a teacher? What do you see when you see a coach? And what's the difference?
Soft skills, often. And remember my experiences down in sport are primarily football, right? So I don't want to label
of course
all coaches in all sports as this. I think that's important, that they don't take what I say literally. But that's important. I think, how do I go with this? Coaches will often deliver questions without the self-awareness to know that they're really just ticking a box. There won't be any awkward silence, and what you'll find is the coaches will ask and answer for the kids anyway. You will go into a school and a teacher will deliver a question as an example, and there could be, Dan, an awkward silence for about 45 seconds. And you see that a lot from the great teachers. They're not afraid to have weird, awkward silences. They're not afraid to scaffold it and say, if you don't know, can you go and pair share that, as in talk to a partner? Can you go to the back of your book and brainstorm it? Now, I know on the football field that's not always easy to implement, but the think, pair, share, square, as an example, is what I've put in the book as how to question effectively. Is every single question that you deliver is technically gold dust. I did some PE mentoring at a private school last week in Surrey for a PE department, where they only have 35-minute PE lessons. So therefore the context to their session is much more get in, run around, do some activity, get out. So it's all specific to the length of the lesson, which is massive. But if you have time, every single question, why ask the question if it's not going to be delivered effectively? And so fundamentally, a question should have engaging process where kids have time to think. Now, let's make this clear. Not think to get the right answer, just think. think to get the wrong answer, think to get an average answer. Just the thinking process alone is fundamentally where there's a bigger challenge. And I think coaches always have this, whether it's an ego or not, I don't know, they always want to make it look good, and teachers don't care. They're not bothered. It won't faze them if things get ugly. It won't faze them if things are challenging. It won't faze them if the kids aren't learning yet. Eventually, we've got a base where kids become higher order thinkers and critical thinkers, and they stretch and challenge, and all of these sort of cue words that I use, they're stretch and challenging themselves, and this is where the metacognition comes in. They learn to be a better thinker then, in summary.
As you're speaking there, I'm picturing myself by the side of a pitch, but I could be by the side of a court or on the course or a pool or in a gym, and I'm seeing a coach deliver an activity. And I'm imagining a scenario whereby the coach stops play and poses a question. But doesn't pose the question to receive an answer, poses a question whereby all he wants is silence just for 30 seconds and some thinking time and a request that each player brainstorms their own personal specific solutions for the question that he's posing. Just giving them some brain space, some thinking time, allowing them to engage in, I suppose, metacognition, as you're alluding to there. So allowing them to process things at a deeper level, process things at a deeper, more meaningful level, and then just allowing them to restart, to play again, and actually put into practice their own solutions that they haven't vocalised, that they haven't been authorised to give out loud, that they're just going and doing, and then stopping, maybe play again, and then maybe asking a few to talk about the solutions that they had. You wouldn't do that all the time because you're stopping play, and depending on the sport that you're working in or that you're practicing, then of course there is a fluidity that you want. But does that illustrate the kind of thing you're talking about?
Yeah, and remember, it's all in context. Would I do this in the driving rain? Of course not. And I think it's really important that the listeners get a toolbox. The whole process is being a top practitioner is having the biggest toolbox that you can have. All I'm saying is that I don't see that type of practice very often in coaching. On a hot summer's day, you've got a bit of time out, the kids are having a drink, the adult players are having a drink. Can you challenge them, stretch and challenge them? Even every moment in that session has to be a learning opportunity. And what I'm trying to say is there's potentially a lot more dead time, we'd call it in teaching, in coaching, where there's opportunities to learn. I'm only coming from my Ofsted training, really. There's opportunities to learn, and those learning opportunities are not being utilised. That's really what I'm trying to get at. Is it always going to look like that? No, but can we just maximise learning in those times? And I think that's what the great coaches do. If you hear about what Pep's doing at the moment, he is just a teacher of life and football. And he is that rigorous about what his vision is and what he wants the players to do. And obviously I'm yet to see him in full practice, but the murmurs that come out of that training ground and the people that see him just say he's just a great teacher of the game.
Absolutely. Section 3, half time, is coaching champions, and I think again we're covering a lot of ground there. In Section 4, second half, teamwork training, and I know that you write a bit more about the specifics of soft skills, the importance of resilience on athlete development, and the utilising behavioural psychology and sports psychology concepts. Do you feel resilience can be taught? Do you think that should be incorporated into activity? Should that be done in the classroom? How would you go about coaching or teaching resilience if you're a coach?
I think a key question that all my peers will always mock me about, mate, is I always say, how does that make you feel? And you can't have enough conversations with your athletes and correlating the learning and the feeling. And that goes back to your own emotional intelligence, because you can't understand others until you understand yourself, and you can't understand yourself until you understand others. And that cyclical nature of people again. So I think that resilience can be grown I mean, I've certainly learned to become more resilient as I've got older. And that's just through life experience. And I think that it goes back to a little bit of mindfulness, that awareness that, they say comfortable with being uncomfortable. And all of these little phrases, I appreciate they're not magic wands, but these are marginal gains to get you to think about what resilience is and how it feels. Does that make sense? And that links to maybe a bit of culture, is because if I'm working with you, Dan, and we're really tight, and I say to you as a colleague, by the way, forget me being athlete-coach relationship, I feel a bit wobbly today. Do you mind if we go for a coffee outside of the training ground, and you get it and you understand life? I'm able to share my thoughts and feelings with you where you're not going to feel that, I'm not going to feel you're prejudging me, right? So if you look at that context of athlete-coach relationship, and you look at that as peer-to-peer, resilience is this word that's used, but if you fundamentally look at resilience comes around about a toolbox where you can give people an opportunity just to feel a bit better. You give them some go-tos in their mind, which could be things like self-talk, like you say. I know you're big on that, and all those processes there. But also fundamentally, people and socialisation can make you feel more resilient, because love and care and passion and identity and showing a vulnerable side in order to get vulnerability back. Does that make sense?
100%.
Because they say great leaders have got to make themselves feel vulnerable. I don't care. I've said this in the book. I've cried leaving every school that I've ever left. And at 22, I probably would have thought, oh, God, that's a bit weak. Men shouldn't do that. But, Dan, do you know what? When you get in your 40s, you don't care anymore. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter that people think like that.
I've hit that mark, mate. I don't care either. I mean, I think that vulnerability is such a great word, and somewhere, my career has gone off in a direction related to what you're talking about in terms of, I would imagine a decade ago, I would have been much more vociferous in saying, I mean, I don't really try to use the term mental toughness anymore, but I would have been very one-dimensional in these are the techniques, this is where you should be, end of story, rather than, so quite unidimensional, rather than bidirectional in terms of, look, to be able to be mentally strong, if that is the right word, or to be resilient, if that is the right word, then I do believe we have to accept and embrace vulnerability. And I think a culture that I think too often, certainly in elite sport, but also in developing sport, at teenage level, at college level, we ignore or we want to push aside vulnerability, and we want to say that's, well, we can't have that here, that's not allowed here, and it's all about mental strength. And I kind of despair a little bit now when I do hear people talking about champions should behave like this, and they should be this way, and they shouldn't be that way, and it's just like, no, some of the most maladaptive things I've ever seen have come from champions, but they're normal people. Premier League, this as well as I do. In the world of soccer, Premier League soccer players make very ordinary decisions for themselves at times. Very ordinary, poor decisions at times. They also do a lot of really good things as well. We're dealing with ordinary people, so vulnerability has to be such a big part of the process of developing resilience.
Yeah, and I linked resilience to vulnerability because I do think they are. I think they are hand in glove.
Yes.
And the reason you say about resilience, I haven't got the answers for resilience, Dan. Again, it's all contextual to the environment that you're in. All I know is that when you're around great people, so let me give some clarity. If I'm walking into the Millwall training ground, and these guys are my friends, so they knew when I wasn't right. And my point is about, you go to a place of work to work. You go to a place of work fundamentally to have a good life. So forget work. Work's just a byproduct of why we get up every day. Socialisation, the reason we live, the reason we're alive, the reason we want to get up every day is fundamentally to get energy from other people. And I think if you look at the top end of the football industry, where the money now is getting so away from real society, The reason so many pros struggle when they possibly leave is because the authentic relationships that they thought they had don't actually exist. And so, going back to resilience, which was the original question, I write a chapter about the story of true resilience, and I didn't really mention a lot of things we spoke about today. I didn't mention vulnerability, now you say it, but when you think about being resilient, resilience for children, remember, is also different resilient for adults, because children don't always understand what vulnerable feels like and how to be vulnerable. And when you've got peer pressure and teenagers, we all know this. Let's be pragmatic about it. It's much harder to be vulnerable as a young person than it is an old person, right?
Absolutely.
So, we just need to be mindful of that. And I think that section 4, which is what you were discussing, I think one of the biggest things that I want to mention, which I think the listeners have to really get on board, is that football clubs, the professional sort of football industry in the UK is sometimes an amazing place, yet a really worrying place. And there's been some massive developments in a good way. But I can only go from my background and my lens again. I've got 2,500 kids in one of my schools. I've got them for a 5-year period. Football clubs potentially have the players for the same period from 12 to 16. And a lot of clubs in the UK at 16 are saying, no, sorry, we don't want you anymore. And these players have been with this club for 5 years. So for 5 years, the clubs have said, yes, year 12, yes, under 13s, yes, under 14s, yes, under 15s. And they get to under 16 and they say, no, you're not good enough. And what I want to mention to all the listeners and our challenge in the book is the difference between coaching and teaching. Over a 5-year period with these schools, I don't hand-pick any of those kids, Dan. I've got 2,600 children and I don't hand-pick any of them. I have to work with them by hook or by crook. I have to add value. And I suppose the difference is, and one of the stories in the book is about how football clubs need to be more self-aware that you handpick these kids and then you say over a 5-year period they're not good enough. Now, I'm not saying every kid is going to get through to a scholarship. I'm not saying that. But surely the stats have got to be more correlated to that type of methodology. That's all I'm saying in it. I don't know what your thoughts are.
I think I'm thinking of 3 words. I'm going to throw in my own bit of alliteration here, and that would be patience, possibility, and potential. I think I'm constantly banging on the patience drum when I talk to coaches about their players. Players of all ages, but again, predominantly young players. Players who perhaps coaches perceive have an enormous amount of skill in their feet or their hands, depending on the sport that they're competing in and developing in. And I think coaches, again, maybe this comes back to the software versus hardware. They'll make decisions around the hardware, they'll make decisions around the software. Oh, they've got the hardware, they've got the ability, but they just don't quite have the whatever it is with the software. And it might be that resilience piece, and it's like patience, because this young person, as you allude to, possibly doesn't have the feeling of what it's like to deal with resilience, and or doesn't have the applicable tools, or didn't grow up in an environment that enabled them to develop put the strategies in place, naturally or otherwise. So I think patience is enormously important. And possibility in terms of, well, if we're patient and we help that player build those tools and strategies and build the resilience and other soft skills, then there's a wealth of possibility for that person within the sport. And even though they don't quite have or they do have the hardware, but it can be learned, or if they don't quite have the hardware, actually if we deliver on the software, their hardware will accelerate no end. And then potential in terms of, I just think, as you're saying there, look, not every young player is going to go on. I mean, at the end of the day, these, whether it's football clubs or rugby clubs or other clubs in other sports, baseball in the States and football over there, NFL, clearly not everyone's going to go on and be a professional, but they have a duty of care, in my opinion, and I know you'd agree with that. They have a duty of care to help young people fulfill potential, and that's not the X's and O's. And they have a duty of care, as you say, is when the 5 years does come to an end, and they don't have the scholarship or they don't move to the next level because not everyone can. That 5 years should have been filled with the kind of messages, the kind of teaching, the kind of learning that helps those young people to, of course they're going to be disappointed, perhaps they're going to be gutted, perhaps they're going to be really, really disappointed, and perhaps they'll get another chance at another club at a lower level or whatever that might be. But those 5 years of X's and O's need to have been enveloped in the software, the human skills, because then you're helping that person go on and potentially fulfill their potential in other domains. So although they're going to be disappointed, it kind of softens the blow is probably the wrong term for it, but it enables them to move on.
Yeah, well, we call it dual pathway. So, have aspiration to be great at football and aspiration to be good at another thing, academia, job, entrepreneurship. So I get it. I just suppose I've always felt frustrated that, again, goes back to self-awareness of you're blaming 16-year-olds for not being good enough and you're a grown adult. And I just think what I'm trying to say is that, come on, look, you're saying they're good enough for 5 years. Not every kid's going to get through, but the statistics saying you shouldn't be releasing 8 or 9 16-year-olds when you've had them for 5 years. And then looking at trialists, Dan, let's be honest, you're looking at a trialist on a 2-week window.
Which is, let's be clear here, you're talking about soccer in England. Probably other parts of the world, probably all parts of the world, but, you're talking about the system in England, Britain, whereby...
At the elite level.
Yeah, at the elite level where they get... And I completely agree. I do agree with that. What the solution is there is possibly another podcast, but I do agree with you. I want to move on here because I just want to get the last 2 sections in, and they're both just as important as anything else, but I'm conscious of your time. I mean, section 5 you entitled "The Final Whistle: The Power of Parents." Good and bad. I assume you've had many an interaction, both good and bad, with sporting parents.
Yeah, listen. The sporting parents one was really to. I've got a couple of good stories in, and one of the stories is from an academy father in the British elite game back in the UK again. He just talks about his journey as a parent and was very, very honest. And he remains anonymous, and he will, but he remains very honest about his experiences of being a dad of a son that was an elite player that was in his national squad at a youth level at one stage. So that was really good, and I thought I'd be a little bit throw a curveball in there, Dan, with a parent that was a cricket mother. She had an elite son that played cricket, so I thought I'd just get away from the football theme a little bit, just to try and get another context and another sport in there. And obviously, the book's called Educating Football, but really those 2 chapters, the second chapter, the title's called The Wrong Type of Love and Parent Envy and How to Hinder Your Children. And I suppose it's a very socio-economic sort of UK-type mentality. And I have to say UK because this is the only place I've ever lived. I've travelled around the world, but I have lived here, and I just sort of see this middle to lower level type parent that are, if I'm honest, just not really knowing a lot about football in the first place, and claim they know a lot about football and hindering their children's enjoyment in the first instance, and secondly, their opportunity to go to the next level because... as I'd say, my dad's a builder, Dan, and I don't tell my dad how to build a house. And I get frustrated when people start telling football coaches how to coach football. And I know everyone's entitled to an opinion, but we need to be mindful of these parents or these coaches. They need some more. They need better support, and they need more respect of what they're trying to achieve across the whole of the UK.
Yeah, I think what I hear you say is a little knowledge can be dangerous, and some people perceive a little knowledge to be a great deal of knowledge. And what I've always found, Steve, is that the vast majority of parents do what they do out of love for their son or their daughter, but sometimes that's misguided, behaviourally, affectively as in emotionally. Sometimes that's misguided, and I think parents need more literature. I think parents need more podcasts. They need more support from the clubs themselves in terms of this is how we're helping your son or daughter get better. This is a way you can be involved that's going to support your son and daughter. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, in a school term, we would just call it triangulation, right? So how we get better behaviours between the school, the kid, and the parent. And I don't, to be honest, Dan, I don't even think I talk about that in the book, actually. I'm just sort of checking through now. I'm just going back to, as you get, sensible, rational thoughts. And I say this on another podcast recently, just everyone start being rational. You're there to enjoy it. The majority of kids are not going to play at a high level. They're playing to enjoy. They're playing to have fun. They're playing with their friends. And if they have the opportunity to stretch themselves further at a better level, under better coaching and with better players, then that's a great opportunity. But fundamentally, a lot of the parents are doing as much damage as they are good, because it becomes over-emotional, and love obviously is important in any part of life, but they're loving their children in the wrong way. And sometimes love is letting kids be free and letting them experience failure and not having to win, etc., etc. So really, yeah, that section, Dan, is just a couple of chapters, I think, and it just highlights really the elite end of the game in one chapter, and then the lower end of the game in the other.
Well said, sir. It's a fantastic book, mate, and what I love about it, and kind of summing up our conversation here today, is you've had a wealth of experience across education, across sport, and you've brought those two domains together. They're very related, but you brought those two domains together, and you've written, by the sounds of it, from your heart and your head. You know, you use that term rationality a lot, but also you're a passionate guy when it comes to this stuff. So it sounds like you've worked hard to combine heart and mind and write something that's going to be really useful for parents, players, and coaches. Where can people find you if you want to be found, Steve? And where can social media, etc., and where can people grab hold of this brilliant book of yours?
Is this where I can apologise for boring everyone to death on social media for my book launch? So yes, on a serious level, Dan, my book is available at www.educatingfootball.com. Fill out a simple form, I send you a link, and then it can be purchased. And I suppose in summary as well, it's 39 short, chunky chapters. You could read a chapter in 3 to 4 to 5 minutes. And I've deliberately designed it like that because people don't read these days. They haven't got the time. It's not that they don't want to read, they just haven't got the time to. So the book is really designed to challenge thoughts. So regarding social media, it's my Twitter is at Steve Sallis. And then Insta, my Insta Solutions Mindsets, which is my business name. And then really, that's really sort of been it's been an incredible journey, and thank you also. Make sure I put this on the record for the opportunity to speak. Your work is well revered in our country and beyond. But I know you're a well respected guy. I know you're well read, and you're well respected in this industry. So I feel privileged for you to give me the opportunity to speak, Dan. Thank you.
No, mate. I've learnt loads. I've written a page of notes here, and I've got some great stuff. And I just love the way that I spoke for about a minute or two on a certain subject, and you just bring it back to one word, like triangulation. Well, we do this in the education sector, and we call this triangulation. After I've spoken for about 3 minutes rambling on, so it's I've picked up some nice little words from the education sector. So no, it's my thanks to you more than anything else. Well, look, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd really love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website at danabrahams.com to tell me what you do think of the Sports Psych show. And if you have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them and try and implement them. So I'm really looking forward to next week's episode. I do hope you can join me. Bye for now.